She had lived long enough not to expect any big changes. At 82, she shuffled slowly through the nursing home hallways, shoulders stooped and eyes vacant, as if she had given up on finding meaning. Her days were marked by silence, lukewarm meals, and memories that seemed more distant with each passing morning. No one expected anything extraordinary to happen to Edith, not the caregivers, not her children, not even herself. But something began to shift when a young volunteer newly arrived at the home decided to sit beside her, not to talk, but to listen. It was like that, with a simple, silent gesture, that what seemed to be merely the end of an ordinary life began to transform into something no one could logically explain. Edith didn't ask, didn't plan, nor did she seek it out. But change would come subtly, almost imperceptibly, guided by something few truly believe in, the real power of prayers, even when offered in silence and without knowing the reason. In the days that followed, the young woman began visiting Edith every afternoon. She would sit across from her, hold her thin hands and begin to pray softly, expecting no response. Edith at first merely watched. She said nothing. But after a week, something different happened. She looked into the young woman's eyes and murmured a single word: "Thank you." It was the first time in months anyone had clearly heard her voice. It might seem small, but in that environment where time seemed frozen, it had the impact of a thunderclap. Some caregivers began to notice she was sleeping better, smiling discreetly, accepting more food. If you believe prayers are just words on the wind, perhaps you need to reconsider. And if you'd like to follow stories like this, please subscribe and like this video. It helps us continue bringing reflections that truly resonate. As the weeks went by, the signs became even clearer. Edith began to recount fragments of her life. She spoke of her childhood in the countryside, of the husband she lost early, of the daughter who moved away and never called again. Little by little, her voice regained its rhythm, and her memory, once muddled, gained surprising clarity. What no one understood was why this transformation was happening now, after so long in a state of apathy. Dolores Cannon, in her sessions with older adults, used to say that the soul is never entirely dormant. It awaits a call, and that call is often triggered by vibrations that don't always come from the mind, but from the heart. Edith, without even knowing it, was being reached by a type of prayer that asked for nothing. It merely offered presence, intention, and light. The nursing home doctors reported improvements in her lab results. Nothing extraordinary in clinical terms, but there was more vitality, more attentiveness. Edith began to walk with more steadiness and participate in group conversations. One day, she asked for a mirror. She wanted to comb her hair as she used to. That's when the young woman, surprised, asked what had changed. Edith simply replied, "Someone is speaking to God for me." That resonated through the nursing home hallways and reached her family members, who had long since lost touch with her. A grandson came to visit, then another, and then her daughter appeared. She brought flowers, sat beside her mother, and cried silently. No rational explanation was offered, just a reunion, as profound as it was unexpected. But what does this tell us about life after death? Dolores Cannon reported that, in states of regression, many souls claimed their journeys in the afterlife were shaped not only by the actions they performed, but by the prayers they received. It didn't matter whether the person was conscious or not, living or disembodied. The vibration generated by a sincere prayer can alter unseen realities. Edith, at 82, was being prepared, not for the end, but for a new stage. And the most curious thing was that this didn't come from a priest or a doctor, but from a young woman who simply chose to love with silent words. Something was moving in the spiritual realm, something that wasn't seen but could be felt. By the end of 2 months, Edith was no longer the forgotten woman she had been. She smiled, walked to the garden on her own, and even wrote notes to the staff. One of them simply said, "Thank you for reminding me who I am." When the volunteer left, Edith didn't cry. She said she now knew how to talk to God on her own. This testimony caught the attention of a researcher studying the effects of intentions on elderly individuals in their terminal phase. Edith's case was presented at a conference and cited as an example of emotional recovery without medication. But for those who lived it firsthand, it wasn't science. It was living spirituality, acting silently, and opening paths once considered closed. The researcher, intrigued by the case, sought similar records. She found accounts in different countries, cultures, and eras. People in advanced states of frailty who showed sudden improvement after receiving constant prayers, even without knowing they were the recipients. The details varied, but the pattern was clear. There was a subtle and gradual response to a specific type of intention. Dolores Cannon, in her studies on the soul, said that there are connections that transcend dimensions. True prayer, devoid of ego, functions as a bridge between the visible and the invisible. And this bridge, once activated, can produce effects where medicine cannot reach. It doesn't replace physical care, but it activates something internal, profound, which often manifests in the body as renewed strength, mental clarity, or simply a will to continue. Edith was one such case. And science, even without understanding everything, is beginning to pay closer attention. Edith's daughter, who had avoided visiting her mother for years due to old grievances, confessed that she had dreamed of her repeatedly during that period. In her dreams, she saw her mother younger, smiling, calling to her with a soft voice. After so long without contact, something within her prompted her to return. She couldn't explain it. She just felt she needed to go. This type of occurrence is more common than one might imagine. Dolores Cannon pointed out that the soul in transition emits signals, and these signals can be picked up in dreams, premonitions, or inexplicable sensations. Prayer, when offered with love, intensifies this connection. It's as if it opens a more direct channel between different planes of existence. The daughter didn't know that the young volunteer prayed for her mother every day, but something within her responded to that call, and the reunion happened. From that point on, Edith began to speak about topics no one imagined she knew. She commented on past lives, described places she had never visited, and used expressions reminiscent of spiritual accounts studied by Dolores. One day, she said naturally that she was no longer afraid to pass on, not because she wished for death, but because she understood that life didn't end there. That left the caregivers puzzled. An elderly lady who had spent months silent was now uttering phrases that seemed to be taken from books on spiritual consciousness. The volunteer simply smiled and continued her visits, even knowing that Edith's time was coming to an end. She understood that her presence had already served a purpose greater than any words could describe. When Edith passed away, there was no sadness among those who had been close to her. There was a profound sense of peace. Everyone felt that she had departed in a state of fullness, like someone completing a cycle, knowing she had been heard, cared for, and most importantly, remembered. The young woman who prayed for her continued her visits to the home, now extending this gesture to others who, like Edith, were simply waiting for a sign that they still mattered. The transformation she witnessed was not the result of doctrines or grand promises. It was the fruit of a simple, consistent act, praying sincerely for someone. Dolores Cannon used to say that the soul responds to intention even before it understands words. And Edith demonstrated this with every gesture she regained before she passed. The case gained traction among the nursing home staff. Some, who previously saw spirituality as secondary, began to allow moments of silence, meditation, and prayer in the rooms. Small groups formed among the residents, who started sharing memories and offering prayers for one another. Something new emerged in that environment. It wasn't about religion. It was human connection. The idea that attention and intention, when directed with respect and affection, could rekindle someone's inner flame. Death, once viewed as an inevitable and silent end, began to be regarded there as a stage of transition. And the elderly, previously isolated in their own worlds, found new reasons to converse, reminisce, and even laugh. This change in attitude didn't come from public policies or external programs. It came from the impact of a personal gesture that touched the soul of an 82-year-old woman, and consequently everyone around her. Dolores Cannon always asserted that the awakening of the soul is contagious. When someone awakens, others nearby feel the call. The prayer offered by the volunteer was not a magic formula, but a practical demonstration of active empathy. Instead of waiting for Edith to react, she acted first, and her action opened a path of invisible yet real transformation. This leads us to wonder, how many people around us simply need this? Someone to pray for them in silence, asking for nothing, only offering presence. This story spread and reached spiritual support groups that serve seniors in the United States. Some of these groups began to incorporate practices of silent prayer into regular visits, not as an imposition, but simply as a form of compassionate presence. The reports of emotional improvement and surprising upliftment astonished even the skeptics. Dolores Cannon used to say that no matter the age of the body, the soul remains active and sensitive to the vibrations around it. Edith proved this. Even with physical limitations, her soul responded when someone offered her light. Prayer in this case was not a request for healing, but a reminder that she was still seen, felt, and loved. This shift in perspective could be the beginning of a new way to care for the elderly, not just with medication, but with real presence, capable of touching what lies beyond the physical. Many elderly individuals feel forgotten, not just by others, but by themselves. Time passes, the body changes, and identity slowly dissolves into a silent routine. Edith's case shows that this disconnection is not permanent. There is a point of return, and that point can be activated by a simple prayer, but not just any prayer. I'm talking about those that come from the heart, without demands, without haste, without judgment. Dolores Cannon described the human energetic field as a system sensitive to intention. When someone prays sincerely, that field is affected. It can generate warmth, emotion, memory, or simply a feeling of being embraced. Edith felt this, and upon feeling it, she began to respond, as if she were returning to the surface after a long time submerged in silence. After Edith's passing, the young volunteer wrote a short account of her experience. She didn't mention names or make a fuss. She simply recounted how a woman who barely spoke began to smile, express gratitude, and even offer advice, all thanks to the strength of a silent connection. This text went viral on social media and was translated into other languages. People worldwide commented, shared, and were moved. Some reported that they began praying for distant relatives, lonely neighbors, and even strangers. What started as an isolated gesture became a movement. Dolores Cannon predicted that in time, science and spirituality would walk hand in hand to understand such phenomena. Perhaps we are beginning to see this meeting point happen, with real, simple, and profoundly human stories. A psychologist who read the young woman's account sought out the nursing home and interviewed the staff. He wanted to understand what had truly changed in Edith. The answers were surprisingly similar. She was remembered, not with words, but with presence, not with diagnoses, but with intention. This made her remember herself. This kind of awakening, according to the accounts, begins with something small: a look, a hand holding another, a prayer offered in silence. The soul, even when weary, listens. Dolores Cannon spoke of the soul as an antenna in constant tune. Sometimes it's silent because there's no signal, but when someone emits that signal with love, a response occurs. It might be slow, but it's real. Edith was living proof of that. Today, the room where Edith lived has been transformed into a small silent prayer room. It has no religious symbols, no instructions, just 2 chairs and a note written by her. It's never too late to remember who you are. This phrase became a symbol of a larger project. Other nursing homes adopted the idea and created similar spaces, not as an obligation, but as an invitation, a place where anyone can sit, close their eyes, and direct a kind thought to someone. It doesn't matter if that person is there in another state or even in another dimension. Dolores Cannon used to say that the soul responds to love with more power than to any medicine, and each new story confirms that this isn't just theory. It's a practice that transforms. Edith didn't become young again, nor did she regain all her mobility, but she rediscovered her voice, her memory, and above all, her worth. This changed everything. And that's the point that makes us think the most. How many people today are living as if they have already passed on? How many are waiting for someone to simply say, with their soul, "I am here"? Prayer, in this sense, is not just a spiritual resource, it is a gesture of humanity. And when done with truth, it activates something that cannot be measured by tests, but is felt in one's gaze. Edith's story shows us that we don't need to wait for miracles from heaven. We can be that miracle for someone. All it takes is the will, action, and prayer. Edith's transformation became an example for many professionals working with the elderly. Nurses, caregivers, therapists, and even family members began to rethink their approaches. They discovered that touch, time, and listening are often more powerful than protocols. Dolores Cannon used to say that the human spirit responds not only to physical stimuli, but to emotional and energetic vibrations. When an elderly person perceives that they still matter, something reignites within them. This doesn't require speeches or complex formulas. It requires presence. Edith didn't need answers. She just needed to be felt, acknowledged. And when that happened, the change began. Thus, her story began to be told not as a mystical miracle, but as a concrete example of how human connection can reverse even the most disheartening situations. Over the months that followed her passing, other residents in that nursing home experienced small transformations. A gentleman who hadn't spoken for years began to hum. A lady who refused to leave her room asked to go to the garden. Every new gesture was celebrated as a victory. The nursing home management decided to incorporate moments of silent prayer as part of the routine, not an obligation, just an invitation. Anyone who wished could participate. The result was a general improvement in the atmosphere of the place. More lightness, more conversations, more attentive glances. What was once just routine began to have meaning. All because a young woman sat before a forgotten elderly lady and decided not to give up on her. This is the true power of intention when guided by the heart. In one of her books, Dolores Cannon states that prayers have effects that extend beyond this life. She recounts cases of people who, in a regressive state, remembered prayers made by family members even after they had left their physical body. They reported feeling comfort, clarity, and even guidance when hearing these prayers on the spiritual plane. Edith may have experienced part of this phenomenon in life. She received prayers that crossed physical and emotional barriers, and she responded to them with recovery, reconciliation, and peace. The volunteer may never know the full extent of what she did, but her gesture proved that prayer is not a waste of time. It is a resource of incalculable value, especially when everything seems to have already been said or done. If you've made it this far, perhaps you're thinking of someone. It might be a distant relative, a quiet neighbor, a friend who has disappeared, or even someone who has already passed on. And perhaps this story awakens in you the desire to do something simple, yet profound. You don't need to call, write, or show up. Start with a prayer. Direct a thought of light, of love, of presence. You may not see immediate results, but something always moves when the intention is sincere. The soul, as Dolores Cannon said, recognizes and responds, and this applies as much to those on this side as to those who have moved on. No one is invisible before a heart that prays with truth. What happened to Edith was not a miracle in the classical sense. It was the response of a soul to the remembrance that it still existed. There is no right age to awaken, nor a right moment to start anew. The soul does not age with the body, it merely waits to be touched again. And that touch can come through words, gestures, or silence. The important thing is that it comes from the heart. Edith, unknowingly, taught that it is still possible to transform an end into a beginning. And that is what makes this story so powerful. It's not about religion, doctrine, or belief. It's about humanity, compassion, and connection. Three forces that, when united, have the power to heal what science cannot explain. If this story has touched you, please share it with someone who needs a little hope. Sometimes a video like this is all it takes to light a lamp where everything seemed dark. And if you'd like to receive more inspiring real stories, subscribe to the channel. Our commitment is to continue bringing content that provokes reflection, renews your faith in humanity, and simply reminds you that no life is too small to be transformed. That each of us can be a channel for something greater, even without realizing it. And that prayer, in the end, is the quietest yet most potent gesture we can offer to those we love, wherever they may be.